Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. So let's get things started. Now, if you did join me from this morning, as I know some of you have, this first part's going to be the same, and then we're going to get into the Photoshop stuff. In fact, there was something I left out this morning about color settings in Photoshop, so we will make sure to cover that today. First of all, I'd like to thank our sponsor. Our sponsor is X-Rite. Definitely take a look at xritephoto.com. There's a lot of great color information for photographers there. There's in-depth gear reviews, a lot of how-to kind of stuff. I'm your host. My name is Joe Brady. In addition to being the webinar manager, I also own a studio with my wife Diane. I teach workshops around the country, and I've been teaching Photoshop and related stuff for, wow, it's been going on, hard to believe I've been teaching Photoshop for 20 years. It's kind of a scary thought if you think about it. So here's what I'm going to cover. First of all, actually this order, I forgot to change this. The order's a little bit wrong. I am going to talk a little bit about monitor calibration and profiling because it's an important first step. Then I'm going to go into Photoshop, and I forgot to do this earlier, but I'm going to go over some color setup and some color space issues in Photoshop just to make it a little bit more clear. Then we're going to go into Photoshop CS6 Live and do some editing. I'm going to try to blow through a couple of images pretty quickly. I'll use a couple of plugins when I think it's necessary, and I'm going to try to use Photoshop by itself as much as possible. Rosemary asked about CS6 and Lightroom 4. I'm not going to be touching on Lightroom today, although I frequently do use that combination where I will do a lot of my basic edits in Lightroom first. In fact, I probably should work on putting together a program for that on the combination of Lightroom into Photoshop. That would probably be a good idea. So real quickly, our solid foundation, you've got to have your monitor taken under, you got to get your monitor under control. You've got to calibrate and profile it. Whatever hardware you're using some hardware is better than none. I'm really fond of these two new devices that you see here, the ColorMonkey Display and the i1 Display Pro. In particular, I love the i1 Display Pro, the little silver one to the right, mostly because of its software. Its software does some really cool stuff. I'm not going to get into that depth with that kind of stuff today. There are some webinars already done about that. But if you're not doing something, you definitely want to have one of these devices. So some options from left to right. And Francesca asked, is it important to calibrate a new iMac? And the absolute answer to that is yes, you better, because they have a little bit tendency to be a little out of control because they're multimedia monitors. They're designed to do everything, and we're talking about photography. So with photography, we're more concerned about accuracy rather than have our monitors make the images maybe look a little sexier. We don't want the monitor to be adding contrast and saturation and adjusting the color of our images. That's fine if you're only going to use your images on your monitor, but not when you're going out to print, because then when you try to print, you're not going to get the same thing you see on your monitor. So you do want to definitely get that under control. From left to right here, again, we see the ColorMonkey Display and the i1 Display Pro. Then you see the ColorMonkey Photo in the middle, and then the i1 Pro 2 on the right. And just to settle this, I always get asked this. So the ColorMonkey Display and the ColorMonkey Photo, the difference. The ColorMonkey Photo on the right, in addition to doing monitor and projector profiling that the ColorMonkey Display does, is that the ColorMonkey Photo is also capable of creating custom profiles for your printer. So if you're a real serious home printer, then you probably really want to take a look at the ColorMonkey Photo on the right. Now the ColorMonkey Display on the left is a pretty cool device in its own right, however. It's got some cool new features, including ambient light monitoring and measuring glare on your screen. It's an extremely easy to use system. Basically, you just plug it in and let it do its thing, and it does a really good job. Now, a couple of you are asking about color spaces, about what is your monitor display? Is it sRGB? Is it Adobe RGB? Is it something else? When I get into the Photoshop color settings, we'll talk about that because that is kind of important. Just real quick, think about your monitor as an important part of your workflow because It's where you're making all your editing decisions. And color space is going to come into that a little bit. I'm not actually the brand new MacBooks with their new Retina displays. I'm actually not sure what the color space on those is. I'm going to have to look it up. My MacBook Pro that I have the previous generation, is in fact an sRGB display. So if I'm working in ProPhoto or Adobe RGB, there may be a lot of images or a lot of colors in my image that I cannot actually see on my monitor. So that is a problem. Now, my solution is, I have some really good graphics monitors both on my desk here at the office and at my home studio that I will then plug into to double check. Me personally, I use ASO monitors, but there's a lot of good ones out there. But generally, there's a price to be paid. You're gonna be looking at a monitor that's going to be $700 and higher. There's no way around that. But you get what you pay for with your gear, just like with your cameras. There's a reason some cameras are $2,300 and some are $600. So same thing with a monitor. As far as Herb asked, what's the best display? Well, excuse me. Of course, a subjective decision. As I mentioned, I'm a big fan of ASO, which is EIZO, but the high-end NECs, some of the high-end Samsungs, some of the high-end HPs are really nice monitors. So again, don't get too hung up on specs, but do understand that a $249 or even a $500 monitor is not going to perform like a $750 or a $1,500 monitor. So that's the way it is. But your monitor, whatever it is you end up with, has to be operating as accurately as it's capable of doing, because this is where you're making corrections to your images. And again, if you saw this earlier, bear with me. But for example, if your monitor is a little bit too blue, as is not uncommon on monitors that are set up for multimedia settings, because that makes videos and games look good. But if you're dealing with photography, you've got this slightly blue image. You go into Photoshop, you do a correction, color correction on it to take some of that blue out, add some yellow in. Now the image looks great on the screen, but you send it out to print and you end up with a yellow print because you added yellow to an image that didn't need it. It was your monitor that was making the image look blue, not the actual image file. The other common thing that happens is your monitor is set too bright. I hear all the time about folks saying, oh, I sent my image out to the lab, it came back, it was too dark. Well, what's happening there is your monitor is set too bright. And you go in and you make adjustments to the image. You bring down the brightness, and oh, now the image looks great on the screen. But then you send it out to print and it comes out real dark. Why? Well, once again, the image was fine, but you're compensating for how the monitor is displaying the image. So you're trying to fix something that's a problem on the display, not actually in the image file. So that's what we're after. We want to eliminate those problems. We don't want to get yellow prints. We don't want dark prints. Use a calibrated system, and then you're going to get perfect prints. Now, here's an interesting question. Edgardo asked, how important is it to calibrate the monitor if you don't print at home but rather somewhere else? It is still very important, and I'll bring that up when we're in Photoshop, because it has to do with getting a file that is as accurate as possible on a calibrated system that you're then going to send out to a lab. So what we do is we work in either Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB, depending on where the images came from. Do the editing, and then when that file is going out to the lab, it needs to be converted to sRGB. Uh-oh, Kim caught my typo. Oh, there's always somebody. Good catch, Kim. It should be let's get perfect prints. Thank you. Sorry about that. Mark caught it too. Oh, really bad English. Wow. I guess I was sleeping this morning, and everybody else was too, because nobody saw that. All right, well, let's continue on. Enough with English. Let's get into doing some Photoshop stuff. So again, the goal is get your monitor under control. We don't want to be guessing. We want to know. And Ryan asks, so what is my initial brightness set to when you begin editing? And that's a good question. I'm letting the device figure that out. That's what the ColorMonkey system does. Either the ColorMonkey Display or the i1 Display Pro or the ColorMonkey Photo. They will get the monitor luminance or the brightness under control so that it is in the right space. It's in the right level. So I don't set a brightness. I let these devices and their software figure that out for me. Okay, so let's go into live into Photoshop CS6. I know most people get their software nowadays by downloading, but that's what the box looks like. So yeah, it's a little bit weird. And Clive asked an interesting question, why use Pro Photo if you're going to convert to sRGB? Good question, and we'll get into that in Photoshop. So let's get to it. Especially for those of you that are being impatient. Patience. All right, let me bring up one of my demo files. Let's do, let's see, let's start with this one. We'll get to this barn in just a second. Now, Hubert's asking about why do an upgrade from CS5 to CS6. There are a couple of there's a couple of reasons, particularly if you are a Lightroom user also. CS6 uses a different color engine than CS5 did. And if any of you were using the Lightroom 4 or Lightroom 3 and CS5, you probably saw a lot of times that when you went from an image from one program to another, that you ended up with a color shift. And the reason is because those two programs used a different color engine behind the scenes. Finally, CS6 and Lightroom 4 now use the same color engine. So when you bring images back and forth for editing, you don't end up with that color shift. So that's really important. Secondly, there's a bunch of new ways things are handled in CS6. That's not what we're here to go over today. Starting with, you can see the screen looks different. It looks more like Lightroom, and there's some new tools that are handy. For example, the patch tool now has content aware in it. There's a content aware move tool. Lots of new stuff, and if you go on to adobe.com, you'll find out some of that. So before we get started with our editing, let's take a look at Photoshop's color settings and just talk about that a bit. So if you go under Edit and come on down here, you'll see Color Settings. So let's discuss about this whole workspace stuff. All right, so here you see this. There's the standard set, or the default set, where you've got Adobe RGB as your standard color space, and then the CMYK stuff, and then color management policies. In fact, let's hit more options and open up everything. Let's talk a little bit about working spaces first. Really, there's three you're going to choose from. Adobe RGB, Pro Photo RGB, and sRGB. And it kind of depends on what kind of photographer you are and where your printing takes place. If you're a wedding photographer and you are only sending your images out to a lab, then by all means stay in sRGB. I know a lot of people poo-poo it, but if that's the space you're working in and that's where your work is taking place in, then go with it. If you're dealing with raw files, you can always open them up and again in another color space if it does need to be repurposed later. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we've got the Pro Photo RGB. Pro Photo RGB is currently anyway the largest color space, almost encompasses the entire visible light spectrum. But there are some dangers with it as well, because if you're dealing with 8-bit images, meaning you've got 256 steps from light to dark, if you do edits on a Pro Photo image that's in 8-bit, then you're almost certainly going to introduce banding into that image because it's a bigger space, but you're still giving it the same amount of steps. Adobe RGB is kind of a compromise. Adobe RGB is also very handy if some of your work is going out CMYK, meaning going out into a magazine or something like that. Now, Steve asked, what is the best space if most of your work is displayed digitally versus being printed? Good question. Most people still have sRGB monitors. If you have an Adobe RGB monitor, you're still among the minority. It depends on how frequently your work's going to be updated. If you want the vast majority of people to see the best color of your stuff, then you would probably want to go to sRGB. Now, the CMYK stuff I would not worry about, but the one thing that you do need to worry about is you do want to make sure that your embedded profiles as you bring an image are preserved, because that's important for the editing process. Again, we're not dealing with the CMYK world, so we'll stay away from that. Conversion engines and the default rendering intent, just leave them alone. You're not going to worry about that. When we cover printing in detail, then we'll go over that. So what I typically do is I will leave my default working space in ProPhoto RGB. However, remember that as long as my Preserve Embedded Profiles is checked, then whatever space the image was in when I brought it in from elsewhere or someone else provided me with the image, it's just going to stay there safely. Now, if you're printing yourself, then it's again, it's going to depend on your printer, but you might want to go into Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB. All right, so let's get to do some editing. So this is a lovely scene, actually not too far from my house. This is Pine Island, New York, which is actually one of the onion growing capitals in the world, strangely enough. Something like 25% of the U.S.'s onions come from Pine Island because of their black dirt. So I've got a really nice scene here, but there's a couple things that bother me about it. First of all, I've got these little bit of branches sticking up that are a pain, and I left myself a little bit of extra room because I felt I needed a little bit more image over here, which I did not capture. So the process, first of all, I'm going to duplicate the background layer because I always want to keep that pristine if I ever need to get back to it. So to do that, two ways. Either you can click and drag it to the little folded page, that will duplicate it, or you can hit Command J on a Mac, Control J on a PC. I'm working on a Mac, so if I ever say Command, you PC folks just substitute the word Control. So I get a copy. It says, it should say background copy, but I had already gotten rid of my background here, so it says layer 0. So I want to go ahead and do some editing. So let's go ahead and zoom in just on the area that is the problem. So I've got this little bit of stuff sticking up. Now in CS6, there are, as I mentioned, there are a couple new options, but let's just try one of the standards first. I'm just going to get my lasso tool and just draw fairly closely around here. And let's see if Content Aware Fill will get rid of this. Now, by the way, when I do this, I don't like to select too many areas at once because it makes it harder for the program to give you a good response. So let's try Edit Fill and change that to Content Aware, and let's see what kind of job that does. And in that case, did a pretty good job. So I can deselect that and move on. Let's try it over here. And again, I'm just going to take a little bit. And by the way, what I like to do is I have an action created for this. So I can just hit one key, but I'm not going to get into actions today. So let's just one more time do, oops, not stroke. Let's do one more time, Content Fill, Content Aware, deselect that. Now let's try one of the new tools. I'm going to drag over here. And in this case, I'm going to, actually, let's use the patch tool. So I'm going to get the patch tool, and with the patch tool, I'll drag around here. And I want to be fairly close. I don't want to get too much beyond the area to get rid of. And if you look up on the patch tool now, I've got Content Aware as an option. So it's kind of like our fill. And then there is how close do you want it to match the area you're sampling from. I generally find loose to medium works the best. Let's try a medium and see what happens. So once I've got my area selected, I just take an area that I want to sample from and kind of let it go, and let's see what it comes up with. And hey, that worked pretty well. So we can see if we turn this on and off, it really filled in pretty nicely. Gave us some of the holes. It makes it look natural. So now we can see that we got rid of those kind of annoying little pieces sticking up. And actually, as I look in the bottom left corner here, I see there's one more piece. So I'll actually use the patch tool one more time. I'm just going to wrap around there and drag the patch tool over here. Let it do its thing, and wonderful. All right, now I had originally increased the canvas size a little bit to give myself a little room. I felt the balance was off a little bit, and that this piece of land here was a little bit too close to the edge. I really wanted a little bit of extra. So what I did was, in fact, I'll crop this back so you can see first. Let's go back to the original cropping. By the way, the crop tool works different in CS6 too. It works like Lightroom does. If the new cropping way in CS6 bugs you, you have the option under the little gear here to go back to what's called classic mode, and it will make CS6's crop tool operate like CS5. But if you're a Lightroom person, it becomes real natural. So I want to add a little bit to this image just for balance sake. And there's a couple of ways I can do it. I could go to Image, Canvas Size, and add a little bit to the width. Let's say it's 12.8, so let's say I want it to be 14. And I want it just to be on the left side, so that means I push the existing image off to the right. And I hit OK, and it will add that much. Now, then I might realize, well, that was a little too much because I didn't know what the numbers meant. So I find an easier way to do my cropping because I crop visually. I don't concern myself usually with standard aspect ratios. I prefer to crop an image how I feel that the balance of the image works best. So I'm going to bring up the crop tool again, and what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to drag the crop beyond the image just a little bit so I get it how I want. And then when I hit enter, it just adds that bit. So it's in essence a reverse crop. It's adding to the image, and I find that a lot easier to do than to add canvas size. And it's also a lot quicker, I think. So what I want to do is just bring a little bit more of this image over. So I'm going to get my marquee tool, and I'm going to select from here to here. Now I want it to be cognizant of things that have shapes, like I've got this tree off in the distance. So rather than just scale this, I'm going to use Content Aware Scale, which is, whoops, right here, which does have a keyboard shortcut, which is kind of crazy. In fact, Katrina Eisman said, just lay your face on the left-hand side of the keyboard if you want to use this keyboard shortcut, or it's just easier to get to here. So when I do that, again, it takes in mind objects and tries to minimize their scaling. And just that one little bit of crop, to me, just added a lot better balance to the image. It gave this channel here a little bit more breathing room, which really, to me, really helped the image. And again, if I turn this layer off, you can see what we've done. Just spreading that left side out a little bit and getting rid of those distractions in the foreground really made for a nice image. Okay, so let me get rid of my old retouch layer here. Lastly, what else do I want to do to this image? Well, I'd like to help the sky a little bit. So I'm going to try first, I'm going to do a curves adjustment. However, what I want to first do is isolate the sky out. So I need to select that somehow. A couple different ways you can try that. Now, first of all, skies are typically blue. So I can go into the channels, and if I click on the blue channel, that will make the sky the lightest part of the image. And we could take a look at green and red, which, by the way, red makes a pretty good black and white all on its own. But when we get to the blue channel, the sky has gotten much lighter. So it makes it easier to use something like the magic wand. So if I go use the magic wand now, hold on, I had my layer turned off. Go back to the blue channel. So now if I choose the magic wand, I selected the light part here, and we're on the default tolerance of 32, anti-alias, and I don't have contiguous on, meaning if there's anything down here that match this tone, it will select that as well. I want to add this area as well, so I just hold down the Shift key, and you see my magic wand gets a plus next to it. And now, in addition, it also picked up some of the channel, but that's real easy to separate out. To deselect, I'll just bring up the marquee tool again with the M. In this case, hold down Alt or Option, and you notice it gets a minus next to it. And now I can just select all of that stuff in one fell swoop, and I have a clean selection of just my sky. And oh, I see one little blinky over here too. So let me get my marquee tool again and deselect that. Now I'm going to save the sky. So save selection. I'll call it sky. So now I have that saved. And apparently I had saved it once before because it's already sitting there. So I'll go back to my layers, and I'm going to do a curves adjustment layer. So I click on the adjustment layers here and go up to curves. Now notice when I did that, because I already had my selection made, the curves adjustment layer comes with a mask, but it already created a mask that just the sky is showing through. If I hold down the Alt or Option key and click on the mask icon over here, you can see it shows me what I got from my mask. And I can see from this, when I created that selection with the magic wand, that it picked up little tiny bits of the foreground as well. Well, an easy way to get rid of that, again, since this is an easy one, with the marquee tool again, I'll just draw across the entire bottom of the image. And since I have black in my foreground, I can hit Option Delete or Alt Delete, and that will just fill it with the foreground color. And now that makes that mask a little bit cleaner. So we've got our curves here. Now a lot of people, the curves are confusing. You can drag this up and down, and you can see it will change the midpoints. And actually in this case, dragging the middle down actually is kind of doing what I want. If you're not comfortable with that, you can also use the targeted adjustment tool, the finger pointy thingy over here. And if you click on here and drag up and down, it will affect that part of the image, but it can be a little bit sensitive. So you got to be careful, because it's also keyed into where in the image you click. And you can see as the eyedropper goes on, you see the little line in the curve. You can see it right in here. It's moving along and telling you where along the curve is that image. So let me back up a little bit. Even if you're not used to curves, sometimes just getting a point in the middle and dragging up and down a little bit is a nice safe way to adjust something like a sky. So if I just want to add a little bit more drama, a little more depth to those clouds, just bringing that down a couple of points will do a nice job of adding drama to that. So you can see just that one little click, and we've got an image that's in pretty good shape. Now, another thing I can do with the crop tool is notice that the rule of thirds is now a default when I click on here. So if I click on this image, as soon as I click on the crop, you see the rule of thirds grid comes up. Now, you don't have to obey the rule of thirds grid completely, but it is nice to have your horizon fairly close to one of the grid lines. If you're big on sky, you want your horizon close to here. If you want the foreground more important, then here. So you have to decide, is there a little too much sky for this image? And sometimes just a little subtle bit of cropping like that will do a better job of having balance in the image. And you can see before and after. It's subtle, but it is important. Now, here's something else that happens though. Let's say you just did that crop, but oh man, yeah, the sky looks better with a little bit less, but I really liked those clouds. So what do? Well, here's what I would do in something like that. If I do want to do a crop, but I want these clouds up in here. First thing I'll do is create a stack of everything I've done so far. And you do that by holding down Alt or Option, clicking on the flyout menu here, and choosing Merge Visible. By doing that, it gives me a layer that has all the edits I've done, but I retain all my layers below, which can sometimes be handy for a couple reasons. One, maybe I only want to do something to part of this layer, and two, I have all my masks sitting there that I can then reuse. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get my marquee tool again, and I'm going to select a lot of the sky just kind of down to the tips of the peaks there. And I'm going to do a content aware scale again. And I'm going to push these clouds down a little bit so that I can maintain those clouds that I became kind of fond of. And one of the beauties of clouds is you can squish them a bit and they still look natural. Alright, so now I can see my line where I've moved my clouds down. I'll bring up C for the crop tool again, and then I'll adjust my cropping so that I can get things where I wanted them. Hit return. Oh, by the way, something else new in CS6 is you have the option, right up here you see delete cropped pixels. If I don't have that checked, what that means is I can go ahead and do my cropping, but I can continue to get back to the uncropped part should I decide I want to change it. Okay, so I like that a bit. I really like that. That was a fairly simple edit, and you can see we went from here to here. And I think we have a much better composition. Something always comes up about sharpening as well. So let's take a look. Let me zoom in on here. I think I resampled this down for speed's sake. But let's say you want to let's look at it at 100%. Let's say you want to adjust the sharpening a little bit. I want to sharpen up this distant trees a little. So let's apply a sharpening. I'll show you my favorite sharpening for landscapes is under Sharpen, Smart Sharpen. So let's go ahead and bring that up. And I'm going to zoom in again, and the trees were the area that I was concerned about. Now, if I click in here, you can see with the sharpening on and off, this image did need some sharpening. And even with 50% and 1.6, it looks a lot better. Two different ways to go on this. 50 with a 1.6, it's actually a pretty good starting point for a lot of landscape work. However, as the radius starts to get big, you are in danger of starting to get a little bit of a halo around your edges. So what I finally found out that works for me in some cases is to bring down the radius to below 1 pixel, and I'll increase the amount. And you can go as high, I've found, of around 180%. And you can get away with this as long as your radius is less than 1. So you could say, again, if I click on and off this, the beauty of doing this is it seems to cause less of a halo than if your radius is that 1.5 or 1.6, and it really makes a nice crisp sharpness. So I hit OK and let it apply that sharpening to the entire image. Now, the downside of doing that is it does add a little bit of noise to the image. Now, you don't notice it in the dirt and in the trees, but you will notice it sometimes in the sky. So let's look at the sky at 100%. Actually, that was higher than 100%. And turn that layer on and off, because that'll show us, in this case, both the crop and the additional noise that got added. So what I want to do is I want that layer to have the sharpening, but I don't want it to happen to the clouds. So what I would do is simply drag. Let me do that again. If you hold down, remember I had my sky mask here already. I do want that sharpening to get applied to the foreground, but I don't want to sharpen the clouds. I don't want to add any noise to that. So if you just hold down Alt or Option, click on the mask that we used previously with the curves, drag it up, it just adds that mask to here, and now what's happening is I've got the foreground sharpened. That's way more than 100%, so let's back off a little bit. I've got the foreground sharpened, but not the sky. Now, when we also did this, here's something that can happen. Still too much sharpening. So look what's happened there. We've got this little halo thing. Sometimes this is unavoidable when you're editing your image and it really drives you nuts. So how do we get rid of that? One more stack. So I'm going to flatten this just so I can maintain. Again, Alt Merge Visible. And I'm going to bring up the stamp tool or the cloning brush. And I'm going to make it a little bigger. What I'm going to do is change the blending mode. So I've got my fairly dark blue sky here, but I've got this kind of light green line. Well, the blue seems about the same as the green. So let's try something. Let's change the blending mode of the stamp tool from normal to darken, which means it'll only affect pixels that are darker than where I sampled from. So if I click on there to load that brush and then come over here, let's see if this blue is darker than the green. Because if it's not, which in this case it is not, you see what happens is it gets rid of that little glowy edge without affecting the green underneath, which is a really handy way of getting rid of some of those bad chromatic aberrations that can happen if you didn't fix that in RAW. Now, the RAW conversion, Adobe Camera Raw as well as Lightroom will do a great job in most cases of getting rid of this stuff now. But I wanted you to see a manual way of being able to do that. So there you go. You can see there's, let me go back to that bad spot. So there's before and after by just bringing up that brush and changing the blending mode to darken. And oh, you know what? Yes, somebody mentioned, don't you have the sky sharpened and not the foreground? Yeah, I did. What a dope. I masked out the foreground and did the sky instead. Well, because here's my mask. I had it the other way around. Simply click on the mask and hit Command-I. And that inverts the mask, and now the foreground's sharpened and not the sky. And I can see I have a little more work to do over here. I've got a little bit, as I zoom in way here tight, I can see I've got a little bit more of that green. So again, I'll just get myself some sky here. And actually, you should do that before you do your masking. And that will allow you to get rid of that. In fact, I'm going to invert that mask again so that I can get to it. It's still not going to let me. Yep, I'd have to turn off that mask. So what I'm going to do is put the mask back to 0. And now I will get my clone tool and just go through there and fix those spots. So I'm not going to sit and make you watch go through all this. So just sample on something that's darker than the green, and then you see as we went along here, we're zoomed in so much that there's still a little bit of fringe there. Really, and this brings up another point. When you're doing your editing, look at your edit at 100%, and then look at it at your print size. So here's the file at 100%, and that's lovely. But what you really need to do is look at your image zoomed in at print size, because you might be worrying about doing edits that are never going to actually show up. So when I look at my print size, there's my actual print size of this particular image. Again, I had downsized this file greatly just for speed's sake. But we can see at print size, you can't see any of this. If I start to zoom in to 100%, there's 100%. Even at 100%, it barely becomes noticeable. So don't kill yourself with your edits. Don't over edit. Take a look at your print size as you're doing your edit and see, is everything working? Oh, which brings me up to another point. How do you set print size so that it actually really matches the print size on your screen? There's a preference in Photoshop that you need to go in and set. So go to Photoshop Preferences and go to Units and Rulers. And what you need to do is tell it what your monitor resolution is. Now, most people think that 75 dots per inch is your monitor resolution. In the vast majority of the cases, it is not. It is something higher. And what you simply do is go to your control panel or your system preferences on a Mac. Let me bring where'd my window go? Wait for it to come up here. Let me hide my power. Okay, here we go. So I look at my displays, and I'll see that my laptop is 1280 by 800. Okay, I got to remember that 1280 number. Then you physically get a ruler and measure your screen from left to right, the visible area. And then, so let's say, for example, let's say that number is, I don't know, let's say it's 14 inches from left to right. You then would divide that, you divide 1280 by 14. Now, in this case, my laptop, my 13-inch laptop is about 10 inches across or 11 inches across. So you just divide that 1280 number by the actual physical size of the number. In my case, my laptop is actually 110 pixels per inch. So if you match this number to the exact size of your monitor, again, the pixels divided by the inches of the width, you'll get your real pixels per inch. And then when you look on your zoom tool and click on print size, it will actually show you the real matching size on your screen to what your print's going to look like. So let's take a look at, let's bring up a panorama here. And this is from Bryce National Park in Utah. And okay, overlay's fine, or the panoramic is fine. I've got a little bit of color issues, and again, when you're dealing with landscapes, when you've got something in the bright sun and you have other pieces in the shade, your camera can only record it as one color temperature, one white balance. But there's different white balances in a scene, which your eye can see. Your eye constantly adjusts to that, but your camera cannot. In this case, one thing in particular, my trees went really kind of dull. So let's see what we can do to fix that. So here's the process again. Let's first of all duplicate the layer, and we're going to try that trick we just did a bit ago and change the blending mode from normal to overlay to add some more pop to the image. Now it got way too poppy, so let's just bring down the opacity and see what it does. And just by turning that on and off, just real quick, you can see that one trick of duplicating your layer and changing it to overlay will add a lot of pop to an image. It's really oftentimes a very good starting point. So what I'm going to do is, once again, I'm going to actually, you know what? I'm just going to flatten this. I like this as it is, so I'm going to flatten that. In fact, I'm going to get rid of these other two layers that I was playing with before. Sorry about that. Let me get rid of these. And okay, so what else don't I like? Well, I've got a nice, really nice color here in the canyon. I think the sky is maybe a smidge too cool. I would like to have it a little bit warmer. So again, we can go through the selection process. Let's try the magic wand. I know a lot of people poo-poo the magic wand, but sometimes it works pretty well. So I hit that. I'm going to hold down the shift key to add to it, and then I'm going to add this bottom part. Yes, it did pick up some of the foreground. So I'll bring up my lasso tool and hold down the Alt or Option key, and I can just get rid of that because it changes that to a minus. Now I can look at the deep horizon here and I can see, oh, there's actually a mountain off in the distance. That's okay. If I'm going to adjust just the color temperature here, it's okay if I add those pieces in, because there was deep haze as it went off into the distance, which was going to cause that to kind of mimic what the sky's doing. So again, before I do anything else, let's save this, save the selection, and just call it sky again. And what I'm going to do is do a color balance adjustment layer again. So we bring up color balance. Now I know it needs a little warmth, so let's just start by adding a little red to it. And oh, that looks better already. And I'll see if it needs a little yellow or blue. Yeah, blue makes it a little bit better. A little bit of red, a little bit of blue. And again, the nice thing about doing it this way is you're not sure what it needs. You can see if I go cyan, it makes it for really bland sky. Let's add a little bit more warmth. And yellow and blue. No, it didn't need any of those, so those were fine. Now, by the way, this is sunset, so seeing my sky go deep off into the east there is something that would be expected. So add cyan. Yeah, it works, but it's not the mood that I want. Again, I'm going for a little bit more warmth. Add a little bit of red. And blue yellow is okay. Again, if you adjust both ways and they both look terrible, then you're done. So I can just turn this on and off here, and you can see we just made the sky warm. It is a sunset. We're getting a little bit of pink down at the horizon there. That's fine. Okay, so now something a little more localized. I mentioned these trees were bothering me. They're really just kind of off. So let's take a look how we can isolate these trees out. How can we select these? Well, magic wand may work. We could try that. So let's go back to our background, click on the magic wand and see what it picks up. Well, let's see the rest of the image. Strangely enough, it kind of might work, but I don't like how it did it. So let's try something else. Let's go to Select Color Range and choose Sampled Colors, and I'm going to come in and select the tree there. And you can see, if I'll adjust the fuzziness up a little bit, what it's going to select. Now there are a lot of trees off in the distance here. The ones that I'm concerned about mostly are these foreground ones. And as I increase the fuzziness, you can see I can have it select more of the image. So just kind of give yourself a ballpark that looks like it's picking up the area you want. You can also click on Add if you have some images, other parts of the image you want to add to, by clicking on the Add dropper. I don't need to do that. So I'm going to hit OK. And yeah, that looks like it did a better job of selecting my tree. I don't want these other pieces out here, I don't think. But let's take a look. Let's zoom in and see. Well, son of a gun, actually what it did collect on mostly were some other trees off in the distance. Although it picked up some of the canyon walls as well. So let's hit the lasso key, hold down Alt to get rid of the pieces of the canyon walls that it selected. And as we scroll around, you can see other pieces that it got that maybe you don't want. But again, there are some trees that you can see along the ridge lines here that are appropriate. And these little dots probably wouldn't even show up, but let's just get rid of them anyway. In fact, let me zero out. And an easy way to do this is just ready to bring up your marquee tool right up here. Again, hold down Alt or Option. Notice it changes it to a minus. And if I don't want any of this foreground here, I can just get rid of it en masse. I do like what it picked up out there, though, so I am going to leave that. So let's save this as well. I'm going to save this selection as trees. And then I'm going to hide it because I want to just leave it alone for a second. And again, I'm going to bring up a color balance adjustment layer. Now remember, I still have that selection made. So when I do that, notice here's what it's showing me. It's selected. Here's the mask that it's selected. And I can decide whether I want this all selected or if I just want to focus in on these trees, which I think I'm going to do. So I'm going to bring up my brush, fill it with black by hitting X to put black in the foreground. And I'm going to leave some of this in. So I'm going to paint over this at about 70%. And just right on the mask, I'll let a little bit of the color change happen there, but that's it. Good. So let's click back on the icon. Now I'm going to do a color balance adjustment just on here. And you'll see as we adjust the colors, only really the tree is going to be affected. So let me zoom in a little bit over here so we can see the tree being affected. All right, so what does this tree need? Well, probably a little cyan. Let's add that. Yep, that's better. Let's add some green to it. Ah, better already. And does it need a yellow-blue adjustment? Maybe, maybe not. Yeah, let's add a little bit of yellow to it. And you can see already that now my green pine tree looks green again, as do these pine needles off here. So that might be done, but let's just go through the highlights and shadows. Let's add a little cyan there. Yeah, that looked better too. A little yellow. And then lastly, the same thing for the shadows. Cyan. Oh, yeah, that looks nice. You see, if we add red, it just makes the tree look like it's dying again. Add a little bit there. A little bit of blue. No. A little bit of yellow. Yes. All right. So we can see here as we turn this on and off, we can see our tree that was looking like it was dying now looks green again. That's much better. Lovely. All right, now let's add one last thing where we've got some issues. Two things. This is a very high contrast tonal scene. So what are we going to do to fix that? Again, you're seeing a different color temperature. Yes, snow in shadow does go kind of blue. But when you look at it with your eyes correct for that. Again, the camera can't do that. It's kind of working in the center of the image with its color temperature, but the rest of the image has gone off a little bit. So what I'm going to do is desaturate this image. So I'm going to create a hue saturation adjustment layer. And in fact, let me just pull this out a second and hide this. I'm going to bring down the saturation, and what I'm concerned about is this area over here. So let's zoom in on this shadowy snow here and bring down some saturation. Just enough. I just want to pull a little bit of the color out of it. And now, just by doing that, now it's looking pretty neutral. However, what it did was, when I did that, I desaturated the entire image. So what I'm going to do is fill this mask that it created with black. Again, Option Delete will fill with the foreground color. And then with my brush, pick my brush back up, I will put white in the foreground. I have a black mask, so I need to paint with white. White in the foreground, and I'm going to work at about 50%, so I'll just type 5. You see my opacity changes to 50. And by painting in white, I'm going to desaturate just these shadow areas here. Let's take a closer look, see if it needs a little more. Make a little smaller brush and just desaturate the snow a little bit to take a little bit of the blue cast off of it. It's okay for it to have some. But again, remember, your camera can't adjust color temperature over an image. That's up to you. All right, if we turn this on and off, you can see we just pulled some of the blue out. And you can see here when we look at our mask, that's what we just did. So there's the masked area where we let that adjustment layer come through. And one last thing we're going to do with this image, and that's some localized dodging and burning to kind of help direct you towards where you want the viewer to go. Now, this is kind of an image that invites you to look around. I mean, it is a panoramic. But what can we do to maybe cause a little bit more focus into the center of the image? So what I'm going to do is create a blank layer. And I'm going to first fill this layer with 50% gray. So let's go ahead and see that's a choice right under fill. I'm going to fill it with 50% gray. Oh, Tracy asked, do I always keep the preserve luminosity box checked when I'm doing color adjustments? And generally the answer is yes, I do that. And let's see. Jim asks, if I had my druthers? Wow, I haven't had my druthers in a while, Jim, but thanks for asking. If I had my druthers, would I make many of these corrections with Photoshop, or would I use Viveza, the Nik Viveza, or would I use both? Good question, Jim. Actually, I usually use both. I don't want to make this a Nik demonstration because not everybody has the Nik software. But I'll tell you what, after we do this this piece here, we'll go ahead in and we'll just do a little final adjustment on Viveza. All right, so we have our blank gray layer here. What I'm going to do is change it from normal to overlay. And what overlay is it's a contrast adjustment layer. Anything on an overlay layer that is whiter or lighter than 50% gray will lighten the image below it. Anything that's darker will darken it. So I'm going to get my brush. I'm going to hit D to put my normal black and white in the foreground. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the areas that maybe are drawing my eye that I don't necessarily want the eye drawn to. For example, the front of this cliff here is a little too bright and it's not a big piece of the subject. There's not a lot of things going on there. So I'm going to minimize this a little bit. This area over here is not a big part of the image. I kind of want to draw your eye more into the middle here. So let me get my brush, and with black, generally when I'm painting light and dark, 20% is about as high as I'll go. So let's just try 20%, and I'm just going to paint on there to darken that up. Same thing over here. Even 20% can be a little heavy. Sometimes I'll start at 10%. And I'm going to darken up on either edge because that's going to force you a little bit more into the middle of the image. By the way, you cannot darken something this way that is white, nor can you lighten something that well that is black. That's where levels adjustments come in. All right, so let's see. What else do I want to do? I'm just going to darken here a little more. I'm going to darken this a little more. And I'm also going to lighten up these shadows here in the center a little bit. Let me darken these edges. So now I'm going to hit X and I'm going to put white in the foreground and still working at 10%. Let's zoom in a little bit on the shadow areas. I want to lighten those up a little bit. In fact, shadows generally need a little more. So let's go 20% on the shadows. And let me paint with some white in there and drag around. And this is very subtle the way we're looking at it right now, but what do you see when we turn this on and off? Are there any other places that need to be lightened up? No. Let's darken up a little bit more. So I'm going to switch again, put black in the foreground. I'm just going to darken up this back ridge line here. And again, this is really subtle stuff, but let's see when we back off. Let's take a look. Let me turn this layer back to normal, and you can see, let me put it at 100%. That's what we did. That's where we painted light and dark on the image. Let's see when we put it back to overlay. Now there's the image after those adjustments, and watch when we turn this on and off. And you can see what a big difference it has on the image. It kind of changes kind of the whole mood of the image. And if you think it's a little bit too heavy, what you could do is just bring the, two choices actually. You can bring the opacity down, or instead of overlay, you can try soft light. And soft light does the same thing as overlay, but with a less of a contrast adjustment. And it kind of redirects your eye a little bit more to the center of the image just by adding a little bit more contrast to the middle and bringing down some of the bright spots that draw your eye that are not main subjects. So lastly, let's go ahead and do a stack. Again, Alt-Option, Merge Visible. Again, gives me a flattened version of all these other layers. Again, by doing this, I still have all my masks available. And let's jump into Viveza real quick. Wow, I'm just about running out of time, and I still have like 4 other images to do. So if you're interested, if you want more of this, I'll be back at 1 o'clock in a little over an hour, and I'm going to do a different set of image edits, and you're welcome to join me. If you want to, just go on to xritephoto.com, and you can register. Again, it's free. If not, again, remember that this recording, when it's made, will have the demonstrations from both the morning and the afternoon. So what do I like, what I don't like here? I think I'd like to actually darken the sky a little bit. So I'm going to put a control point in the sky. Let's make that nice and big. I'm going to bring the brightness down a little bit to add a little more depth. And generally when I'm doing skies, don't do your adjustment right at the top or the bottom of the sky, because that has a tendency to start to cause some banding. So let's, again, I'll bring the brightness down a little bit. And I'm going to add a little structure. That should bring out what little clouds are there. It'll bring them out a little bit better. And I'll duplicate that, Command D, and bring another one over here to the other side. Now, if I just click off on those, by the way, I mentioned, if you look at the control point list right here, here's where it will actually show you what part of the image is being affected by that particular button that you've chosen, so you can see right there. I wish you could actually export these masks. I'm hoping in the future version of Viveza that you can do that. And let's see, lastly, one other piece that was bugging me a little bit was this, again, this cliff face. When I darkened it up, I thought it got a little bit too saturated. So I'm going to just bring my area of influence down a bit here, and I'm going to bring down the saturation of that cliff face a little bit, just because it was getting a little bit too much notice. And I'm going to further bring down the brightness. All right, just a couple of subtle changes. Actually, that's really all I wanted to do to further finish that up in Nik, and we get to see the effect afterwards. And there we go. Now, Philip brings up a good point. He says a lot of what I'm doing you can do in Lightroom with the gradient and adjustment brushes. Philip, I completely agree with you. My workflow typically is to start in, I will frequently start in Lightroom and then come into Photoshop. But it depends on the image, and it depends on what I feel needs to be done with the image. So let's just take a, whoops, I didn't want to do that. I accidentally duplicated something. Where's my backy uppy? Okay. All right. So again, let's turn this on and off, and we can see, again, if you think it's too strong, you can just back off on it a little bit. So that's why I like doing it that way. And let's look at it full screen. And then I can bring up my menu so we can see where we started. Here's where we started. And kind of overly bright, dead-looking trees to an image that has a lot more pop to it. Let's take a look at this one. Okay, this was a panoramic stitch. This is Mount Moran in Grand Tetons, and you can see we've got a little bit of leftover stuff. So let's fix that first. Again, the process. You wouldn't have to to do this on another layer, because there's no reason you'd want to keep it. I'm just going to keep it so we can see. So I'm going to create a new layer, Command or Control J, and I'm going to zoom in down on my bottom part here. Again, I'm going to use the magic wand. I do want it to be contiguous because I don't want it to pick up the top and bottom spots at the same time. I just want to do one at a time. Now, before I do a fill on this, I need to expand this out, because if I don't, I'm going to end up with kind of a nasty little border here. So after you do your selection, go to Select, Modify, Expand. And I'm going to do 4 pixels, and let's see what that gives us. So when I do that, you can see it expands it out just enough so that there's going to be some overlay over the existing image. Then I can go to Edit, Fill, Content Aware, and let it do its thing. Now, I picked up a little bit of stone there that is no longer there. So I will just get my lasso tool, kind of select around that area, and again, Edit, Fill, Content Aware to get rid of that. Lovely. So that's gone. So let's do the same thing up top. Same thing. I'm going to use the magic wand. Go to Select, Modify, Expand. I'll add the 4 pixels to it. And Edit, Fill, Content Aware. By the way, I have an action for this that does all that in one keystroke. I have it saved on my computer, but I wanted to show you the step-by-step. Okay, so now we've got those little bits filled, and I need to do some other edits because I can see I've got some schmutz here. Apparently I got a dirty sensor here. Ooh, shame. So what I'm going to do is select that with the lasso tool. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and get that one as well. I'll hold down the space bar to see if I see any other places where that has happened. And the only place it would really show up is in the sky, so the answer is no. So with both of those selected, once again, Edit, Fill, Content Aware, and they are gone. Beautiful. So now I've got my basic edits done. Now, beautiful scene. The scene was a little bit more intense, so what are my options? How can I approach this? A couple different ways. First thing, I've got my background fix here. I'm going to duplicate that layer again. Again with Command J, and you see I have background layer 2. So let's try the trick we tried earlier and change it from normal to overlay. Now, all right, so we've got a lot more drama in the sky, but obviously the image has gotten way too dark. Let's bring the opacity down and see at what point does it start to look kind of nice. Actually, that's not too shabby right there. Now my shadows are still too deep, but that's okay. I'm going to leave that there a second. And what I'm going to do is now go to Select, Color Range, and I'm going to select not a sampled color, but I'm going to select the shadows. And actually that is too much. Let's go back to sampled color, and I'm going to pick these deep shadows in here and bring this fuzziness number down, because this is really kind of the areas that I don't want to be affected. I don't want to have those shadows turn to black on me. And I can see here by adjusting the fuzziness that that's working. So I hit OK there, and it's going to select that. Now I'm going to create a mask. I'm going to add a mask to this layer just by clicking on the mask icon. And now if I Alt or Option click on the mask, you can see it's shown me which areas it is masked out. Now what I want is actually the opposite. Those are the areas I don't want to have the overlay affected on. So again, I hit Command or Control I to invert that mask, and then I can click on the icon and decide, is that working? So now maybe I can bring the opacity of that overlay up a little more. And what it's doing is the mask it protected those shadows a little too much, although the rest of the image is looking pretty good. So here, one thing you have to remember is masks are layers. You can do everything with a mask layer that you can do with an image. So for example, I want this area to be masked, but not that much. So simplest way to do it, do a levels command right on the mask. So I'm going to hit Command or Control L, and I'm going to bring up the output levels. What that's going to do is lighten the black parts of this mask. And you can see as I drag this up, it makes it just softer. So I want to slightly protect those shadows, but not completely. So I'm going to bring it up about there or so. Hit OK. And now the mask is protecting the shadows, but not completely. It's allowing them to stay within the same ratio as the foreground. And look, that quickly, we got the intensity of that overlay, but kept our shadows kind of the same. And the image is looking really good. Now, I've talked about this before. One of the things our eyes do is our eyes adjust color temperature constantly. So if you look up in the sky, it's going to give you the color temperature for that. If you look down here, it'll give you the color temperature for that. Your camera can't do that. It can only pick one. And the end result was down here got a little bit too blue. I really need it to be a lot more neutral. So I need to do a color balance adjustment. And I really just want it to happen here. But I'm not going to worry about that right now. Let's go to Color Balance Adjustment layer. And what does this image need? Well, I said it was too blue, so it's probably going to need a little bit of red. And it's definitely going to need a little bit of yellow. That's way too much, though. Let's just back off on that a smidge. And what I'm doing is I'm ignoring all the stuff up here. I'm looking in here. I want to get that to be a little bit more neutral. So let's check the highlights, do the same, add a little bit of red, a little bit of yellow, and then the same with the shadows. A little bit of red. Shadows, though, do have a lot of blue in it, so I think I'm actually going to add a little blue. And so we've adjusted the color of this foreground, but it's kind of messed up the rest of the image. But that's okay. Let's turn that on and off so we can see what's happened. So now the foreground looks more neutral, but the rest of the image has gone weird with its color. So really simply, I've got my blank mask here that it automatically created for me. Since less than half of the image is where I want to have this effect take place, I'll put black in the foreground. With the mask clicked, hit Option Alt or Alt Delete and fill in the mask completely so that none of this is coming through. Then get myself a brush, and by the way I adjust my brush size, Control Option on a Mac, Control right click on a PC, click and hold, and as I drag left and right it gives me a bigger or smaller brush. As I drag up and down it gives me a softer versus a harder edge. So let me get a brush about that big. And also I'm going to work at about, probably about 80%. So to get 80% opacity, I just typed the number 8. And if you look up here where it says opacity, it just changed to 80%. If I wanted 10%, just type in 1. You want 100%, type 0. I want 8, so I type 80. And in case, always somebody asks, what if I want 17% opacity? Well, then just type 17 real quick, and you get 17. So again, I want my 80%, and I need to put white in the foreground now, so I hit X to switch them, because I've got a black mask. I want to open up that color adjustment I did to this foreground, and I just start typing, and look how the warmth is coming back into the image. It's taking away that overly blue that we were getting because we have two different color temperatures going on in the scene. And let's go back to full screen here and turn this on and off, and you can see, there we go. Now, I might have overdone it a bit, but again, that's the beauty of having it on a layer. I could just back it off a little bit, add a little bit of warmth back into here to give me that kind of split color balance. All right, what else would I do for this image? Little dodging and burning. Because I want to change kind of the direction, how you're looking at the image. So let's create a dodge burn layer. And I'm going to do that by clicking a blank layer. And I'm going to change it. Actually, I'm going to fill it with gray first. So, and the reason is so you can see what's going on. So I'm going to click on fill, and I'm going to fill it with 50% gray, which gives me this 50% gray layer. Now I need to change the blending mode of this layer from normal to overlay. And by the way, these blending mode layers, if you take a look, they're organized by what they do to the layers below them. Obviously, this group darkens, this group lightens the layers below. This one affects contrast. Now, overlay and soft light, you're probably going to find yourself using fairly frequently. This is kind of the weird grouping. Only found one of these that ever works, and that's difference, but subject for another day. And then these will affect the color of the layers below. We're going to work with overlay. So let's change this to overlay. And the way overlay works is anything that's 50% gray is transparent. Anything that's lighter will lighten the layer below. Anything that's darker will darken. So what I want to do is direct the view more to the face of the mountain and a little bit of this branch. I've become very fond of this branch here. So I'm going to do a little bit of dodging and burning. So I'm going to darken up the edges. Usually I'll work with, I'm dealing with black, I'll work with 10%. So I just type in 1, and you see my opacity change to 10%. I'm going to give myself kind of a bigger brush, and I'm just going to paint left and right a little bit. In fact, I'm going to come down here on these corners. It's just technically a little bit of a vignette, but it actually will be effective. Give myself a little smaller brush. I want to darken this reflection at the base of the mountain a little bit, and I'm going to darken here a little more. I'm also going to zoom into the peaks because I want to add a little bit more contrast to some of these areas right here. So again, I get my brush back, make it a little smaller, and I'm going to just again 10%. It's very subtle. In fact, after it's done, you can hardly see that anything was actually done, but it's going to actually have quite a dramatic effect on the image. Same thing down in here. All right, and I'm even going to darken that stone. Let's look at the foreground here. I'm going to darken the face of this stone a little bit. And then I'm going to create a little bit of a lighter swath through the middle to kind of draw your eyes up through the middle. So I'll get my brush a lot bigger. I'm going to switch to white now, so I hit X to put that in the foreground, and I'm just going to put a little light swath across there, and kind of to direct across this branch and up to the peak. That's Mount Moran, by the way. I'm going to lighten that up. Now, just that little bit of subtle image editing. In fact, let's turn this layer back to normal so you can see. So that's what we just did. Those are the little bits of lights and darks we did. One of the nice things about having this layer filled in with gray is that you get to see clearly what it is you've done. Plus, if you decide you want to make these transitions a little gentler, I can then blur this. So I can go to blur, Gaussian blur, and decide, well, maybe I want to soften these transitions a little more, which is going to be dependent on the resolution. Oop, that was way too much. I kind of want to maintain the edges a little bit, but just make them a little gentler. Put this back to overlay. Now, watch what happens when I turn this layer on and off. It doesn't look like we've done much, but when you turn it on and off, it has a big effect on the image. Look before and after. Turn that off. So there's before. And there's after. It's subtle, yet it's powerful. You're more directed, you're more drawn to the middle of the image because it's gone a little bit lighter. And you can also fine-tune this. I might decide that I don't want you focusing on these trees here, even though I put that swath in the middle. So let me make that a little bit darker. And then I turn that on and off. And you can see again, I think with the little darkening of the peaks and the little lighting in the foreground here, it just draws you into the image a little bit more. And you can see here, we could see where we started. Here was our starting image, and here's where we ended up. And let's try one thing. I'm going to do one thing a little bit extreme. Let's see, just out of curiosity, I haven't tried this yet in this image, so you're seeing this for the first time along with me. Let's do a stack. So again, Alt Merge Visible, because I may or may not want to use this. I'm going to go into Nik, into Silver Effects, which, by the way, if you're into black and white images, Silver Effects is an absolute must-have. Even though Photoshop does a pretty decent job with black and white, it's nothing like Nik does. So as you go through, you see there's all these defaults here, and I can scroll down and see if I see one that's attractive to me. Let me see this high structure one. Oh yeah, that's pretty sexy. I like that. Let me zoom in on that a bit. Also, if I want to darken the sky a little bit, I can add a color filter here. Let's see what yellow does. Oh yeah. Now it's creating a little bit of a halo there, although that meant that there really is that gradation in the sky. Might be a bit extreme. Orange and red are going to make it worse. Let me come down a little bit here. Because the beauty is I can choose yellow and then back off the strength. So that's just a little bit. It adds a little bit of darkness to the blue. And I'm not going to do any local adjustments, I don't think. Let me zoom in the center just for a second here. Nope, I think I'm happy with that. I'm not going to do any local adjustments because I'm actually not after a black and white image, although that was a pretty nice black and white image, as we'll just see in a second. So let's see what this does. It's going to add this black and white layer on top of what we've done. Again, which might be kind of cool all on its own. Come on, catch up. We're just waiting. Yep, it's still cooking. All right, so let me just see a couple questions here. Let's see. Reed asked, good question. What is the advantage using Photoshop as opposed to Lightroom or Camera Raw? They all work together, and I talked to the group earlier, and I'd like to hear you guys' feedback as well. I think that it might be worthwhile for me to do a program on the process of editing in Lightroom and then going into Photoshop and when to do it and when not. I think that might be handy for you guys. All right, so here's my black and white. Lovely, but I like the color image. How can I get maybe a hybrid of the effect of Nik, how it really brought out some of these details, but keep my color? And well, there's two choices. Change the blending mode, first from normal to luminosity, and bring the opacity down a little bit. And look what that's done to the image. Even though it was a black and white layer, look at how it has brought out some of those fine details. I really like that effect, and I do find myself a lot creating black and white layers and then doing that adjustment, just changing the blending mode, because look at the effect. Look what it's done for that. I really like that. Now, you might decide you like it in some places and not in others. I don't necessarily like what it did to the sky. I love what it did to the foreground, and I think it's a little strong amongst the trees. So again, the beauty is I've got my masks here. First thing, I can just bring up my big brush, change it back to black, and decide I'm going to paint pretty heavily. I don't want it to affect my sky. So I can just paint out the effect it had on the sky, and then I can diminish the effect it had on the trees. I'll go down to 50%, and I'm going to paint in the trees a little bit just to bring a little bit more of the pure green back, because the trees are not the focus to me. If me in this image, it was the peaks. Now what I've done is I've masked out, and look what it's done, how it's brought out that fine detail. And I love how it's increased the reflection of the clouds here in the water. And I love the detail it's brought on the bed of the lake. So I think I'm happy with that. And wow, I'm out of time. I can't believe it. So I'm going to I hadn't done that before with this particular image. I love the effect of it. I'm going to save this. One other thing I might do is I might increase the saturation of this. Let's try that real quick. Because doing that luminosity of a black and white does take away some saturation. So let me just increase that back a little bit. And yeah, just 10 or 12 points. I think that works. Let me see that on and off. Yeah, I like what it's done. It's brought some of the blue back. And yeah, I think I got a finished image. So in fact, I'm going to save that. And while that's saving, one other new thing in Photoshop CS6 is it will save in the background. So even though this is currently actually saving, you can see it save. I can actually open another image. I can go do something else. That's cool. Also, Photoshop CS6 auto saves in the background. So if you had a system crash or something like that, when you open up Photoshop again, it will bring back your saved image. Finally, that was something really we were waiting for. So let's sum up, because I'm out of time. Yeah, Ted asked, is it possible to do these for 2 hours instead of 1? Yeah, Ted, I could go on for days. Maybe we'll work on something online where we can do a smaller group and some longer, more in-depth Photoshop stuff. So first of all, use Photoshop. Again, try to get the best capture you can at possible. Learn to meter. Get your color correct. You create custom camera calibrations. But understand there are limitations. Your camera can only record one white balance. And a lot of times in the scene, if you've got a bright sky and you have pieces in shade, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have two different color balances in the image. It's true that Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw can fix that before you even get into Photoshop, and we'll work on that next time. Also, your eyes have much greater tonal range than your cameras can ever capture. So a scene that you remembered in a certain way may show up very different on your camera, and often does when you're dealing with landscapes. So that's what Photoshop and Lightroom can help. Before you do any editing, however, it's really critical that you have your monitors under control. Make sure you're doing something for calibration and profiling, because you got to get your monitor in the best state it can be. And when you do that, what ends up happening is when you send out for prints or when you print them on by yourself, then you're going to get much better results. So really, again, the whole theme, the whole takeaway of this is you don't want to be guessing that your color's right. You don't want to be guessing that all this work you've done on editing is actually going to print. You need to know, and for that to happen, you got to have some hardware in place. If you have any questions that are driving you particularly nuts, and you just can't wait for another webinar, send me an email. Send it to answers@xritephoto.com, and I'll do my best to get you an answer as soon as possible. So again, thanks to our sponsor, X-Rite. Again, take a look at xritephoto.com. There's a lot of great information and tech support and how-to stuff there, really to make sure that all the work that you put into your edits and your photography will end up coming out in your print, and that's what we're after. So that's it for me today. Thank you guys. Thanks for the great questions, and I hope to see you all online again soon. Until then, be well. Bye-bye.